In this episode, we are stepping into a part of auditing that can sound abstract until you realize how often organizations struggle with it in plain sight. And that is the question of who actually owns IT risks, controls, and standards. New learners sometimes assume ownership is obvious because a company chart has managers, teams, and departments. But real accountability is often much less clear once systems, vendors, data, and business processes start overlapping. A security problem can affect operations, a business decision can create technology risk, and a technical control can support a legal or financial requirement all at the same time. That is why auditors do not stop at asking whether a risk has been identified or whether a control exists on paper. They also want to know who is responsible for making decisions, who must maintain protections, who approves exceptions, and who answers when something is weak, outdated, or ignored. When ownership is clear, organizations can act faster and more responsibly. When ownership is vague, important tasks drift between teams, and everyone assumes someone else is handling the issue. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good place to begin is with the idea of ownership itself, because in an audit setting, ownership does not simply mean touching a process or using a system every day. Ownership means a person or defined role has recognized responsibility and authority over something important enough that they are expected to make decisions, accept consequences, and ensure the work gets done. That responsibility can apply to a risk, a control, or a standard, but it does not mean the same thing in every case. A risk owner is usually the person accountable for understanding and accepting the effect of a particular threat or exposure on the business. A control owner is the person or role responsible for making sure a safeguard is designed, operating, and maintained as intended. A standards owner is usually accountable for defining, updating, communicating, and governing the rules that guide consistent practice across the organization. These ideas are closely related, but they are not interchangeable. And one of the most common beginner mistakes is assuming that the same person should always own all three. Sometimes that happens, but often proper governance requires those responsibilities to be separated or at least clearly distinguished. It helps to pause on why ownership matters so much, because this topic is not about labeling boxes in a diagram just to make documentation look tidy. Ownership exists because organizations need decisions to be made by the right people at the right time, especially when trade-offs, funding, deadlines, and risk tolerance are involved. If nobody owns a risk, it may remain known but unmanaged. If nobody owns a control, it may exist only as a good intention or a one-time setup that quietly stops working over time. If nobody owns a standard, teams may gradually drift into different practices, creating inconsistency, security gaps, audit findings, and confusion during incidents. Clear ownership also supports escalation. When a weakness is found, the organization should know who must investigate, who can approve remediation, who can accept temporary exposure, and who must report status to leadership. Without that clarity, conversations become slow and frustrating because people talk around the issue instead of making accountable decisions. In that sense, ownership is a control concept by itself because defined responsibility helps prevent neglect, duplication, and unmanaged exceptions. When auditors evaluate ownership of IT risk, they are trying to answer a basic but powerful question. Who is accountable when technology-related exposure could affect the organization's objectives? Risk ownership should usually sit with someone who understands the business impact and has enough authority to respond appropriately. That does not always mean a purely technical person. A server administrator may understand the system very well, but a business leader may be the one who truly owns the consequences if the system fails, leaks data, or becomes unavailable. This is an important distinction for beginners, because people who operate technology are not always the same as people who own the business risk created by that technology. Good organizations recognize that difference and assign ownership accordingly. They do not let risk live as an abstract technical concern floating between teams. Instead, they connect it to business accountability, So someone with real decision-making authority understands the exposure, approves treatment plans, and accepts responsibility when risk is tolerated for a period of time rather than fully removed. Control ownership requires a slightly different lens, because controls are the actions, settings, reviews, approvals, and other mechanisms that reduce risk or help detect problems before they become larger. A control owner is not merely the person who benefits from the control or occasionally checks its output. The control owner is responsible for making sure the control is designed correctly, placed in the right process, and operating consistently over time. If the control depends on a monthly review, the control owner must ensure that review actually happens and that it remains meaningful. If a control is automated, ownership still matters because someone must verify that the automation continues to function after system changes, access updates, or vendor modifications. This is where beginners sometimes imagine that automation eliminates accountability, but it really does the opposite. Automated controls can be powerful, but they still need a human role responsible for oversight, maintenance, exception handling, and evidence. A control without an owner often becomes unreliable in quiet ways, especially when turnover, tool changes, or business process changes occur and nobody clearly sees it as their responsibility to keep the control effective. Standards ownership adds another layer, because standards are not the same thing as risks or controls even though they influence both. A standard is a defined rule or requirement that promotes consistency, such as how systems should be configured, how access should be reviewed, how data should be classified, or how changes should be documented. Standards help translate broader policies into repeatable expectations that technical and business teams can actually follow. The owner of a standard is typically responsible for keeping it current, making sure it reflects organizational objectives, aligning it with external requirements when necessary, and communicating it across the enterprise. That owner may not personally enforce every detail every day, but the role should ensure there is a process for updates, approvals, exceptions, and monitoring. Without a clear standards owner, organizations often accumulate outdated requirements that no longer match the technology environment or the business model. Teams then either ignore the standard, interpret it differently, or create local workarounds, all of which weaken control consistency. For an auditor, undefined standards ownership is a serious warning sign because it suggests governance may be happening informally rather than deliberately. One reason this topic becomes confusing is that risk owners, control owners, and standards owners often work in the same space and may seem to overlap. They do overlap, but they are still different kinds of accountability. A business leader might own the risk of unauthorized access to a sensitive application because the consequences fall on that area. An IT operations manager might own the access review control that helps reduce that risk by ensuring entitlements are checked regularly. A governance or security function might own the standard that defines how access must be approved, reviewed, and documented across all systems. These roles should connect logically, but it would be a mistake to assume they all collapse into one person just because they touch the same issue. Auditors evaluate whether those lines are understood and whether the people involved know what decisions they are empowered to make. When everyone understands where accountability starts and ends, the organization can coordinate effectively. When those lines blur, people may either overstep, creating confusion, or step back completely, creating dangerous gaps. A common misconception among new learners is that ownership can be assigned merely by naming a department instead of identifying a responsible role or person. Saying that security owns the standard or IT owns the control may sound good in a meeting, but it often falls apart under real conditions because departments are made of many people with different responsibilities. If a finding appears, who exactly responds? If a standard needs revision, who starts the process and gets approval? If a control fails, who is expected to correct it and provide evidence that it is working again? Vague departmental language can hide a lack of real accountability, especially in large organizations where work passes through multiple teams. Another misconception is that ownership means doing every task personally. In reality, an owner can delegate tasks, rely on supporting teams, and use automation, but accountability should still remain clear. That means the owner does not disappear when work is distributed. They remain responsible for ensuring the outcome, reviewing performance, and escalating problems when the arrangement is not working. To make the idea more concrete, imagine a company introduces a new cloud-based collaboration platform for employees across several departments. The platform stores internal documents, includes access permissions, and supports integration with other business tools. Very quickly, questions appear about who owns the risk of data exposure, who owns the controls around user provisioning and permission reviews, and who owns the standard for acceptable configuration and data handling. If these questions are not answered clearly, trouble follows. The business may assume IT is handling everything because it implemented the platform. IT may assume security is responsible because the issue sounds security-related. Security may assume the business owns the content risk because it decides what information goes into the platform. In a well-governed environment, those distinctions are clarified early. The business owner accepts the business risk associated with the platform's use. IT or an operations function owns specific operational controls, and a governance or security function owns standards that define the baseline rules. That clarity allows audits, incidents, and change decisions to happen with far less confusion. From an audit perspective, evaluating ownership means looking for evidence that accountability has been defined, communicated, and put into operation rather than merely discussed. Auditors may review governance documents, risk registers, control matrices, policy frameworks, standards documents, committee records, exception approvals, and role descriptions. They compare these sources to see whether ownership is consistent and believable. If a risk register names one owner, but meeting notes show a different team making all the decisions, that inconsistency matters. If a control matrix identifies an owner, but the person interviewed cannot explain the control or show any evidence of oversight, that matters too. If standards are published, but nobody can explain who reviews them or how often they are updated, that is also significant. The goal is not to collect paperwork for its own sake. The goal is to determine whether ownership exists in a way that can survive staff turnover, organizational change, and day-to-day operational pressure. Real ownership shows up not only in documentation, but in behavior, decision-making, and follow-through. Another important teaching point is that ownership must be supported by authority and competence, not just assigned in name. An organization may designate someone as the owner of a risk or control, but if that person lacks enough seniority, access, time, or knowledge to act, the ownership may be weak in practice. This happens often when responsibility is pushed downward without the power needed to enforce standards, request remediation, or escalate conflicts. It also happens when highly technical responsibilities are assigned to people who do not understand the process well enough to judge whether the control is effective. Auditors therefore look beyond the label of owner and ask whether the role is positioned to succeed. Does the person receive the right reporting? Can they influence decisions? Are they part of the approval process for changes and exceptions? Do they understand what evidence supports effective operation? Ownership without authority creates frustration, and ownership without competence creates false confidence. A mature environment makes sure that those who carry accountability also have the means and understanding necessary to exercise it responsibly. Exception management is another area where weak ownership becomes visible very quickly. Standards and controls are rarely followed perfectly in every case, and sometimes a business reason exists to deviate temporarily from the normal rule. That is not automatically a governance failure. What matters is whether the organization has a disciplined way to review, approve, document, and monitor exceptions. Someone should own the decision to grant the exception, someone should understand the associated risk, and someone should track when the exception expires or must be revisited. If those roles are unclear, exceptions tend to become permanent through neglect. A team may continue operating outside the standard because everyone assumes the approval came from somewhere, sometime, for some reason. Auditors are especially interested in this area because unmanaged exceptions reveal whether ownership is real. A well-owned process leaves a trail of accountable decisions, risk acceptance, and planned follow-up. A poorly owned process leaves scattered emails, verbal assumptions, and outdated approvals with no clear evidence that anyone still remembers why the deviation was allowed. Organizations also need to think about ownership over time because risks, controls, and standards are not static. New systems are introduced, business priorities change, regulations evolve, vendors are added, and legacy platforms remain in place longer than expected. All of these changes can weaken ownership if the organization treats it as a one-time setup rather than an ongoing governance responsibility. A risk that once belonged clearly to one team may change when a service is outsourced or moved to a shared platform. A control that once worked in a manual process may need redesign when the workflow becomes automated. A standard that made sense 5 years ago may now be misaligned with cloud services, remote work, or modern development practices. Auditors therefore evaluate whether ownership is reviewed and refreshed as the environment changes. Strong organizations revisit accountability during change management, policy review, major incidents, and organizational restructuring. Weak organizations leave old names and documents while the actual responsibilities drift elsewhere, creating a gap between formal governance and real operating conditions. There is also an important independence point for beginners to understand. Ownership should be clear, but it should not erase the need for oversight and challenge. The person who owns a control may be responsible for its operation, but another function may test whether it is effective. The person who owns a risk may accept it, but that acceptance may still need review through governance channels. The team that owns a standard may write it, but leadership or committees may approve it to ensure it reflects enterprise priorities rather than one group's preferences. This balance matters because good governance is not just about placing names next to responsibilities. It is also about making sure ownership does not become unchecked control. Auditors pay attention to this because a system of ownership without review can become insular, defensive, or inconsistent. The healthiest environments combine clear accountability with transparent oversight, so owners know what they are responsible for while the organization still maintains confidence that risks, controls, and standards are being managed in a fair, effective, and enterprise-aware way. As we wrap up, the main lesson is that evaluating ownership of IT risks, controls, and standards is really an exercise in determining whether accountability is real enough to guide action when things are normal, when things change, and when things go wrong. An organization may have strong technology, capable people, and polished documents, but if nobody clearly owns the key decisions, those strengths can still break down under pressure. Risk ownership connects exposure to business accountability. Control ownership keeps safeguards working, and standards ownership keeps expectations consistent across the enterprise. Auditors examine these areas because unclear ownership often sits underneath recurring findings, slow remediation, unmanaged exceptions, and inconsistent practices. When ownership is thoughtfully assigned, supported by authority, and refreshed over time, the organization is far more likely to make responsible decisions and respond effectively. For a new learner, that is the durable takeaway to remember. In governance and auditing, clarity of ownership is not administrative decoration. It is one of the foundations that makes real control and real accountability possible.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.